Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The inn at mile 108 on the Caribou Trail. It was built near the headwaters of the San Jose River. The inn at mile 108. It was a welcoming wooden structure that stood 3 stories high, offering worn-out miners respite from their work. The hotel was open for 10 years, during which time not a day passed without the smell of Agnes McVee's lamb stew drifting down the road, luring anyone in the vicinity into the big building. But all wasn't as it seemed at mile 108. Actually, things were downright rotten. Agnes McVee and her husband Jim ran the inn. Their son-in-law helped out. He was a big man named Al Riley. Agnes was the obvious leader of the three. She was voluptuous, tall, and broad, and bellowed her welcome to customers in a thick Scottish brogue. Legend has it that every man who set eyes on her was at the same time stricken by her unusual beauty and amazed by her incredible strength. She was able to flash a dazzling smile while hoisting a huge cauldron of stew from the kitchen. "Come on in, boys," she'd sing out to visitors. "Stew just came off the fire." Of course, men wouldn't come to the inn just for the stew. Agnes also served up other frontier amenities, providing several different brands of rock-gut whiskey, flea-infested beds, and the company of women. Business did as well as could be expected in such an isolated location. Miners came and went, but Agnes, Al, Jim, and the soiled dubs they employed were not getting rich. Until, that is, Agnes came up with another way to do business. Henry Dawson was steering his wagon up to the inn at mile 108 early one morning in March 1875. He was widely known as one of the wealthiest miners in the region, having worked his claim alone for nearly a decade, painstakingly putting away every nugget that he dug up until he had amassed a small fortune in mineral wealth. He carried his gold around with him wherever he went, and it's estimated that he had over $11,000 worth of it in his wagon when he pulled up to the McVee Inn. Agnes McVee was waiting for him at the doorway. "Well then, Mr. Dawson," she cried out, flashing the solitary miner one of her brilliant grins. "What a pleasant surprise!" Dawson was a man of few words and only tipped his hat as he walked into the inn. He ate in complete silence, addressing Mrs. McVee only after he had finished with his stew. "Agnes," said the gruff old miner, "I have a business proposition for you." "Business proposition?" "Yeah, business," the miner responded, wincing as he took a swig of whiskey. "I reckon you know I've made good over the last few years." "I've heard you've done all right," Agnes responded. "Well, I'm thinking about making a home on my claim. A real home. I guess what I'm saying is that I'll be needing myself a woman." Agnes looked at the man, trying her best to look shocked. "What are you proposing, Mr. Dawson?" The miner was silent for a long moment before he answered. "Well, I was thinking maybe I could buy one of your girls off you." "For good?" Agnes replied. "I mean, buy her for life? That's what you're talking about?" Dawson looked Agnes straight in the eye. "Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'll offer you $2,000 in gold." Agnes was suddenly receptive. 2,000? You have that in your wagon right now?" "That and more," the miner said, a proud look in his eye. "Well," Agnes replied, "you may have yourself a deal, Mr. Dawson. Why don't you stay the night while me and Jim have a talk about this?" If the unfortunate practice of buying brides wasn't uncommon in the Old West, neither was it so ordinary that it didn't warrant commemoration by the buyers. Henry Dawson, deciding that he had cause for celebration, called out to Jim McVee for another shot of whiskey, followed by another and yet another. Meanwhile, Agnes sneaked out the back door to where Al Riley waited in the bushes with a rifle in his hands. "Now's the time," she hissed at her son-in-law. "He's getting soused in the front room." Al crept around the inn to the front window, rested his rifle on the sill, aimed carefully, and fired, blowing a hole through Henry Dawson's back, killing him instantly. Agnes and Al wasted no time. Hauling the dead miner's body out of the inn, they carried him back to his wagon where Jim was already unloading Dawson's gold. After they had removed every nugget and the last whiff of gold dust, Jim McVee then drove the wagon several miles from the inn, unhitched his horse, and pushed it into a lake just off the Caribou Road. When the authorities found the wagon with Dawson's body in it, they concluded that he must have been robbed and killed while traveling on the wagon road. As for Agnes, Jim, and Al, their success inspired them to continue their nefarious operation. They killed only patrons who were at the inn when no one else was there, usually disposing of them the same way they killed Dawson. It didn't matter who it was. The three murdered without discrimination. Merchants, gold miners, bordello madams, and alpine farmers all became victims at mile 108. Pretty well every man that came up to mile 108 to buy one of Agnes's girls got himself a bullet in the back. The countryside became a virtual graveyard over the next several years. One by one, dead bodies kept turning up until the corpse count was numbered at over 59. Oddly enough, the local authorities never suspected the proprietors of the inn at mile 108. Convinced that a group of homicidal highwaymen were at work, the law turned its attention to the surrounding wilderness. But no matter how thoroughly posses combed the forest, no traces of a band of robbers was ever found. Who knows how long this murderous operation would have continued if a young gambler by the name of MacDonald hadn't shown up at the inn in the spring of 1884. He was a drifter and a gambler, returning home to Montana after spending a few years plying his dubious trade in Barkerville. His saddlebags were near bursting with his ill-gotten lucre, and he wanted only one more thing from the Caribou before he went back to Montana: a wife. He arrived at the inn at mile 108 in the early evening, the only patron in the building that night. Al Riley greeted him, serving up a bowl of the house stew and a few glasses of whiskey, while Jim McVee loaded his rifle in the back of the inn. MacDonald would have met his end within the hour if Agnes hadn't walked into the dining room when she did. For when the matriarch looked at the solitary young man wolfing down her lamb stew, she fell instantly and completely in love. She rushed up to Al Riley, who was watching his quarry from behind the bar. "Who's that?" she asked breathlessly. "How should I know?" Riley shrugged. "Calls himself MacDonald. He's here for a woman." Agnes walked up to where MacDonald was sitting. "Hi there," she crooned to the young man. "Al tells me you're in the market for one of my girls?" "That I am, miss," MacDonald said between mouthfuls. "I'm going back home to Montana, and intend to be married before I get there." "Well, I know just the one for you," Agnes responded. "The best girl I've got. And all it'll cost you is $4,000 in gold." Before she went up to get the girl, Agnes walked into the kitchen and told her husband to put the rifle down. "We're calling this one off," she said. "This man's gonna get the bride he paid for." Returning from the second floor with a young woman in tow, Agnes handed her over to MacDonald in exchange for a bag of gold nuggets. She stood back to appraise the sight of the young couple standing in front of her. "Lord, what a handsome pair you make," she beamed. "Now make sure you head straight for a preacher and do this proper like." MacDonald spent the night at the inn, and the next morning Agnes, Jim, and Al were standing at the doorway as the couple rode off down the Caribou Road. Agnes McVee waved at them. "Look at that," she sighed to Al Riley and her husband. "There is nothing in the world like the sight of a young couple in love." Neither of the men joined her when she burst out in raucous laughter. Indeed, if Agnes bothered to look, she might have been concerned by the ugly scowl smeared across her husband's face. Jim McVee was none too happy that they let MacDonald get away just because Agnes took a fancy to him, and while Jim was able to swallow his pride as the freshly acquainted pair rode away from the inn, by midday he decided that he would never be able to respect himself if MacDonald got away. Loading up his horse, Jim hit the Caribou Road after dinner, telling Agnes and Al that he was off for a short leisure trip. He didn't return until well past midnight, leading a riderless Pinto by the reins. Agnes and Al were sitting in their empty bar, throwing back glasses of whiskey, when the clatter of horses' hoofs in the stables announced his arrival. "That'll be my fool husband," Agnes said. "Why don't you go see what's taken him so long?" I was back before long, standing uncomfortably in front of Agnes McVee. "Jim's got that MacDonald boy's horse with him," Al said, avoiding Agnes's gaze. "He's got bags of gold, too." It was as if Agnes wasn't allowing herself to understand. "How can that be?" she asked her son-in-law. "Jim killed him, Agnes. The boy is dead." Without saying a word, the dame of mile 108 got up from where she sat, walked up to her room, and quietly shut the door behind her. The next morning, both Jim and Al were surprised to find Agnes already up, cheerfully stirring a pot of porridge in the kitchen. Singing to herself as she put the two steaming bowls in front of Al and Jim, Agnes tousled her husband's hair playfully and sat down next to him with her own bowl of breakfast. Agnes had a way of brightening up a room when she was in the right mood, and that morning the inn was glowing. Agnes cracked one joke after another, and the room was full of laughter. Until that is, Jim began to choke. Coughing and wheezing, he tumbled from his stool, writhing on the floor as foam bubbled through his lips. "You've poisoned him," a shocked Al Riley said to the woman sitting across from him. But Agnes did nothing to acknowledge her wheezing husband. She kept up her casual banter until Jim stopped breathing. Then her tone changed. She was suddenly serious. "Let's bury this fool in the back." The couple had just picked up Jim's dead body when the law burst through the front door of the inn. Both Agnes McVee and Al Riley were arrested on the spot. It turned out that while Jim had indeed killed MacDonald the night before, his newly purchased bride managed to get away. She went straight to the local sheriff after she was freed and told him everything about the inn at mile 108. During the upcoming months, Agnes and Al denied everything, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The shocked authorities found 8 girls imprisoned in the inn, scared witless and half-starved. They were so terrified of Agnes that none of them would say anything about their experiences at the roadhouse, but the remnants of death all around the inn spoke volumes. Investigators found charred bones in the hotel's fireplaces. Dozens of buried corpses were unearthed around the building. By the summer of 1885, there was more than enough evidence against Agnes and Al to put them on the gallows. Yet Agnes was unwilling to subject herself to a public trial. Swallowing a vial of poison, she had sneaked into prison. She took her own life the night before she was to go to court. Al's trial was a swift affair. Found guilty of multiple charges of kidnapping and murder, he was promptly hanged for his role in the killings. Years passed, and the evil proprietors of the inn at mile 108 passed into local legend. In 1892, the original building was torn down and rebuilt on the other side of the Caribou Road. A post house, store, and telegraph station were attached. The gold rush subsided. New settlers came with the intention of making crops grow from soil. Old adventurers left for new opportunities. The years passed and the horror of the atrocities faded, but they would never be completely forgotten. People were always conscious that most of the gold the trio stole was never found. In 1924, a local farmer found $2,500 in gold buried on his property. Years later, a second cache of gold nuggets was unearthed, this one worth over $6,000. There's nothing like the idea of buried treasure to keep a legend alive. And the estimated $100,000 of unclaimed gold buried around mile 108 has ensured that the legend remains. But it is not just the allure of buried treasure that keeps the morbid tale of mile 108 circulating, for strange things began to be reported around the area soon after Al Riley was hanged. It started with the lights. Travelers who found themselves around mile 108 during the gloaming hours saw them, orbs of light that bobbed up and flashed in the not-too-distant darkness. Some saw white lights, others said yellow, and still others claimed they were red. Regardless of color, everyone who laid eyes on them felt the same sense of foreboding, struck by an unpleasant certainty that whatever they were, they weren't friendly. More than one frazzled traveler, intending to set up camp, kept riding through the night to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the ominous light show. Those who bore witness to the lights at mile 108 never had anything good to say about the experience, but some travelers had much more unpleasant encounters near the McVee's old inn. People setting up camp in the area would be woken in the middle of the night by horrible screams and blood-chilling laughter coming from the darkness. According to witnesses, there was nothing subtle or remote about these sounds. They were loud and terrible, seeming to come from the mouths of terrible beings that were just beyond their firelight. Travelers who didn't immediately pack up and hit the road right then and there would be kept up the entire night by these unearthly sounds waxing and waning throughout the night. And then there were the stories of travelers who slept through the night without being disturbed, only to wake up and find that their mounts had been taken in the night. Horses and mules vanished without a trace, leaving not even the slightest track to mark their passing. Indeed, these animals' disappearances were so complete that no one suspected bandits were responsible. The mysterious animal thefts were quickly linked to other bizarre occurrences around mile 108, and it was deemed these vanishing acts were the work of the many discontented and vengeful spirits that fell victim to the McVee's machinations. The strange happenings along the stretch of the Caribou Road continued to get stranger. By the late 1880s, the legend of the road took on a life of its own, and word began spreading that men were disappearing around mile 108 again. Then it stopped. When the McVee Roadhouse was torn down in 1892, no one heard another story about flashing lights, strange sounds, or vanishing animals. The hills around mile 108 went suddenly silent and dark at night. No more animals went missing inexplicably, and people began stopping at mile 108 again. The brutal McVee killings and the haunting of the area passed into legend. And while no one would ever be able to explain the shadow that fell over the region between 1885 and 1892, it was largely suspected that Agnes, Jim, and Al were still responsible, somehow reaching beyond the grave to continue their reign of death and misery over the region that was once theirs. The Ghosts of Dawson. What used to be the town of Dawson lies in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in Colfax County, New Mexico, some 15 miles northeast of the town of Cimarron. There isn't much left of the once bustling mining community. Accessible by a single dirt road branching off Highway 64, Dawson is in the middle of a dusty nowhere, overrun by sagebrush and rattlesnakes. The only indications that the town ever stood are a commemorative placard situated on the abandoned town site and the Dawson Cemetery, a burial ground still marked by an old iron fence. The placard is a state historical marker, telling an abridged version of the ghost town's short history, while the Dawson Cemetery is a plot of earth riddled with far too many identical white crosses, which many would say whisper a story all their own. Unlike so many mining towns before it that sprang up around mineral wealth, Dawson was distinctly modern in that it was planned and financed by a single corporation. The site was purchased in 1867 by a rancher named J.B. Dawson, who operated a ranch there until 1901, when the Dawson Fuel Company purchased the 20,000 acres with the intention of capitalizing on an enormous coal seam that had been discovered on a nearby mountain. But it wasn't until 1903, when Phelps Dodge bought the land, that the town of Dawson was born. At its peak, Dawson boasted nearly 9,000 residents. The Phelps Dodge Company oversaw the construction of homes for its workers and their families. They were fully staffed hospitals. For children, there were schools, for culture, an opera house, and for entertainment, a bowling alley. At its peak, Dawson was a shining example of what a mining community could be. A far cry from the Leadvilles, Deadwoods, and Sacramentos of the world. Dawson marked the end of the murderous madness that accompanied most mining towns of the American West. Nevertheless, when death came to Dawson, it came on a scale that put every other violent frontier town to shame. Disaster struck on October 22, 1913. A faulty dynamite charge blew the insides out of one of the mines, killing almost everyone inside. By the time all the bodies were accounted for, It was determined that 263 men had perished in the explosion. It was one of the worst mining disasters in American history. The victims were buried in a special part of the Dawson Cemetery, their anonymous graves marked with small iron crosses. From then on, Dawson's graveyard loomed larger in the public consciousness than the town itself. Whatever the people of Dawson were doing by day to day, no one could ignore the sprawling stretch of corpses on the side of the mountain. No boot hill in any western town could compete with the air of death and desolation that hung over the town cemetery. The graveyard eventually seemed to take on a life of its own, and no one in Dawson was ever the same because of it. Soon after the disaster, frightening stories began to spread through the town. Some heard strange sounds unlike anything produced by cricket or coyote, drifting down from the graveyard, long lingering wails or moans that would come and go throughout the night. Others passing by the cemetery gates after sunset claimed to see dim humanoid shapes walking through the darkness, vague forms that vanished the moment anyone tried to take a closer look. Citizens of Dawson quickly decided that their cemetery was haunted. Locals assumed that the graveyard was full of minor spirits that were angry or confused at their sudden and needless deaths. Looking back, however, it might be said that the ghosts of Dawson Cemetery were trying to warn the living. From February 8, 1923, 10 years after the first mining accident broke Dawson's heart, another explosion tore through a crowded mine. Another 123 miners gave up their lives digging for coal. The men's remains were dug out of the rubble and buried alongside the bodies from the 1913 disaster, the identical small iron crosses marking the graves of the nameless dead. So it was that two of the worst mining disasters in the United States took place in a humble New Mexico town. The Dawson Cemetery, now bristling with 386 miners' crosses, became a monument to Dawson's darker side. After 1923, whatever went on within the town itself was overshadowed by the specter of death that hung over the graveyard. It's fitting, then, that curiosity seekers looking for the mining town in northern New Mexico today will find only desolate Dawson Cemetery, while the rest of the original buildings in town are either torn down or now located on the private property. The cemetery is open to anyone who cares to see it. The iron gate to the burial ground still stands under the blazing southwestern sun, its metal letters spelling Dawson, somehow ominous on the lonely mountain. Unlike the residents of the mining town, who left the borough shortly after Phelps Dodge shut down the mines in 1950, the ghosts of the Dawson Cemetery have remained behind. There are countless stories of strange happenings in the graveyard. Daytime visitors often claim to have heard barely audible whispers on the wind, the voices of men warning of some unseen and unfathomable danger. Others speak of fierce cold spots that surround specific grave sites. People who were sweating a few moments before find themselves shivering in the sudden chill. The cold spell lasts for a few short moments before lifting without warning, leaving witnesses frightened and confused, wondering what exactly they had just experienced. But the most dramatic account of ghosts in the Dawson Cemetery are set during the evening hours. That is when the daytime whispers become full-throated moans drifting over the burial ground. Curiosity seekers and investigators have witnessed balls of light floating over the expanse of iron crosses. Some claim to have spotted vaguely human-shaped patches of glowing fog drifting through the graveyard. The forms hover for a few moments before dissipating into the night air, leaving no trace that they were ever there. It might be more suitable to call the dead of Dawson Cemetery corporate casualties rather than men who were felled by the violence of the Old West. They were, after all, employees of Phelps Dodge, men who were taken care of by the company that settled them, men who never had to worry about gunfighters, cowboys, or Indians. Yet the miners who died in Dawson were subjected to a sort of violence that could only be called Western. Like cowboys, teamsters, lawmen, and outlaws, the miners of Dawson risked their lives to make a buck, and in the end, for 386 of them, their rough jobs on the hard periphery of the United States cost them their lives. They still don't seem to be too happy about it. Dead Men in Barkerville. Like a rose in a briar or a bride in a bordello, Wellington Delaney Moses stood out amongst the rough rabble of frontier America. A man who invariably chose silk over denim, wine over whiskey, and soap instead of spit, Moses strutted through the dust and dirt of the West's worst boom towns with an unmistakable, even probable, air of gentility. In a world where manners could easily be mistaken for weakness, and weakness might get you killed, Moses' ostentatious displays of refinement made him a virtual alien. And, as if this carefully pomaded hair and gold watch fob weren't enough, Moses was also a black man. While it was true that in the 1850s most black Americans were tied to plantations in the South, Moses wasn't too concerned with the issues of slavery, because like everyone else who went out west, Moses was there to make a buck, and for the line of work he was in. Public attention equaled greenbacks. This Western Jim dandy ran a barber shop and a bathhouse in San Francisco during its early years. While he was known as one of the best in his profession, he made most of his money hawking his famous hair invigorator, a cosmetic panacea that when applied to the scalp would restore lost hair, give a coiffure a shining gloss, and cure headaches to boot. Moses himself was a walking advertisement for his product, claiming that his own full head of hair was once bare as a cue ball. But that was before I started using hair invigorator. Moses would say to soon-to-be buyers, I got the recipe from an old Indian medicine man. I challenge you, my friends, point out one bald Indian. Moses made a good living selling his snake oil to unwitting San Franciscans for a short while, yet the nature of his business wouldn't allow him to stay in the bustling gold town for too long. Dissatisfied customers accumulated daily, and it wasn't long before a good number of Westerners, bald and angry, wanted to do him harm. Not the kind of man to outstay a welcome, Moses left San Francisco in 1858, taking a ship up to Victoria on Vancouver Island, where he promptly set up another shop. But business in this colonial town wasn't nearly as brisk as it was further south. For some reason, Moses found that it was more difficult to convince British subjects of his hair invigorator's efficacy. Quickly deciding that he needed a more ingenious market, Moses turned his attention to rougher frontier towns. Luckily for him, the Caribou Gold Rush was just about to sweep through the interior of British Columbia. Sometime in 1865, Moses packed up his razor, his strop, and a few crates of hair invigorator and headed up the Caribou Road, planning on setting up in Barkerville, the most far-flung town on the Caribou Trail. Beginning his journey in the town of Yale, Moses met and befriended a career adventurer named Charles Morgan Blessing, who was heading up to Barkerville himself. The two men traveled the road north together and quickly became fast friends. Blessing told Moses tales of his travels through the West, and Moses, for his part, abstained from trying to sell Blessing any of his wares. The relationship changed when they arrived at Caribou Trail's 70-mile house. It was there, while they were throwing back a few shots of overpriced whiskey in the overcrowded roadhouse, that they met James Barry. Barry was a Texan gambler on his way up to Barkerville, as well hoping to cash in on the mining town's lively gaming scene. Accompanying Moses and Blessing for the rest of the way to Barkerville, Barry quickly made the northern journey into an intolerable affair. If the Texan was civil enough when he met the pair, his onerous nature began to emerge almost as soon as their trio set foot outside 70-Mile House. Any man spending time in western mining towns would have been well acquainted with boorishness, but the vehement bitterness of James Barry was enough to get through even the thickest skin. If Moses and Blessing were able to deal with the Texans' near constant diatribes against anything and everything in the wide world, his vehement and voluble racism took its toll on Moses and Blessing's friendship. By the time the trio reached Williams Lake, Moses was ready to go his own way. He split up with Blessing and Barry in the town of Quesnel, staying behind for a few days to provide the miners there with some badly needed shaves and haircuts, as well as a few bottles of his hair tonic. Moses made the last leg of the journey to Barkerville alone and promptly set up another barber shop when he got there. Business was good. So good, in fact, that he had little time or opportunity to check up on Charles Blessing. He finally did run into a drunk Jim Barry in one of the town saloons. Barry was none too friendly, making it known as loudly as possible that no man of color was any friend of his. When Moses asked about Blessing, however, Barry went oddly quiet. "I've got no idea what became of that yellow belly," he said. "I guess he just lost his stomach for the life. Halfway between here and Quesnel, he up and left. Just turned around and went back the other way. Didn't say a word as to why." Moses trusted Barry about as much as he liked him and didn't put too much stock in the drunkard's blowhard story. But in the Old West there was a word for men who asked too many questions: dead. So Moses went back to business, doing his best to shut Blessing and Barry from his mind. Who knows? He might have succeeded in putting the past behind him if forces bigger than Wellington, Delaney, Moses did not have other plans. The nightmare began exactly 1 week after Moses spoke to Barry. Moses was cleaning up shop after the last customer of the day when the bell on the door rang. "Sorry, partner," Moses said without looking up from his sweeping. "I'm closed up for the day. Come back tomorrow." Whoever was at the door was silent, but the sound of heels on the floor made it evident that he hadn't heard Moses. The barber got irritated. "Listen, man, I said Moses was unable to finish his sentence, so dumbstruck was he by the sight in front of him. Standing there in his barber shop was none other than Charles Morgan Blessing. "Jesus, Charlie," Moses gasped, unable to contain his shock. "What in tarnation happened? You look half dead." Moses wasn't exaggerating. His friend's face was the color of faded paper, and his eyes were strangely blank, disturbingly lifeless. There was a moment of silence while Charlie just stood there, staring straight through Wellington Moses. "Well then," Moses said, suddenly uncomfortable, "what can I do for you?" Charlie sat down on the barber's chair without saying a word. "Well, you do need a shave right badly. This shouldn't take a second." Moses threw a hot towel over Blessing's face and turned to get his straight razor. The sight that greeted him when he looked back at Blessing's covered head made him swoon with horror. A second ago Moses' friend was lying back in the chair with a clean white face cloth. Now the cloth was soaked in blood, red drops dripping down the side of Blessing's face onto his clothes and the floor. The barber could only stand in shock when a deep and anguished voice came from under the face cloth. "Sarah Murphy," it said. "Talk to Sarah Murphy." And then he was gone. Wellington let out a little shout when Blessing vanished. The terrified barber stared at where his friend had just been sitting, his eyes fixed on the blood-soaked towel on the chair, on the streaks of blood that were still dripping onto the barber shop floor. For long moments Moses didn't know what to believe. He doubted his eyes. He doubted his sanity. He doubted reality. Yet through all of this, he held onto the one thing the terrified visitor had said: "Talk to Sarah Murphy." Besides the bloody mess, this message was all Blessing had left. Moses knew Sarah Murphy well. She was one of the popular hurdy-gurdy girls, a dancing troupe that toured the Barkerville watering holes. He had spoken to her often in the past, but now found himself hesitant at approaching her. It took Moses a couple of days, but he finally worked up the courage to approach the young woman after one of her shows. He waited until the crowd around dispersed and then sauntered up as casual as he could. "Hello there, Sarah. Hell of a show tonight." Sarah turned towards Moses, smiling brightly at the sight of the nattily dressed barber. "Well, look at you, Wellington. It's been quite some time, hasn't it?" Moses was about to respond, but the sight of the necklace hanging around her neck caught his tongue and froze his heart. Tied to a simple leather cord was a gold nugget shaped like a tiny human skull. Moses had seen this same nugget before, hanging around Charlie Blessing's throat. It was his most prized possession. When they were riding up to Barkerville, Charlie told the story about how he had won the nugget in a poker game from none other than the famous Mexican bandit Joaquin Murrieta. "What is it, Moses?" Sarah asked of the stunned barber. "Where did you get that nugget?" "It was given to me by an admirer," Sarah responded, obviously put off by Moses' manner. "Who?" "Well, if you must know, it was from a Texan gentleman named James Barry." Moses was instantly seized by the realization that Barry had killed his friend on the way into town. He turned his back on the dancing girl and stormed out of the saloon, all at once struggling with guilt, grief, anger, and wonder. He came back from the grave to give me this message. Moses thought. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the frontier barber had a thought that was unrelated to turning a profit. I have to set things right. He saddled up and headed out the next day, riding out to see Judge Cox in the town of Richfield, a few miles to the south. Moses told the judge the whole story, leaving out the part about Blessing's posthumous visit to his shop. Moses' information came just as a posse found Charlie's corpse, carelessly buried behind some bushes just off the Caribou Trail between Quesnel and Barkerville. Barry was arrested a few days later, held in Barkerville until August 1867, when the famous Caribou Gold Rush, Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie, arrived to conduct his trial. Wellington Moses was a key witness in the trial, and based largely on the information he provided, Judge Begbie ruled the Texan was guilty of murder. James Barry was hanging from his neck before the month was up. Wellington Moses ended up spending the rest of his life in Barkerville, running his barber shop well after the rush of gold miners subsided and the mountain town settled into a modest existence. By the time he passed on in 1890, the former hairdresser and confidence man was one of the town's most loved patriarchs. He was remembered most as a man who loved to tell stories about Barkerville's wilder days. His favorite and most repeated tale began with the same phrase, "And then there was the time I almost shaved a dead man."